The slave girl's ritual sacrifice. In the early 10th century, Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan witnessed one of the most methodical ritual killings ever recorded. Traveling along the Volga River, he encountered the Rus people, Viking traders known for their elaborate funeral customs. When a chieftain died, preparations began not just for his burial, but for those who would accompany him into the afterlife. A slave girl volunteered to die with her master. For 6 days, she existed in a state between life and death. She sang and drank alcohol daily, participating in festivities while fully aware of her approaching end. Witnesses described her as appearing joyful, though Ibn Fadlan noted her trembling when led to the ship that would become her funeral pyre. On the 7th day, the girl was dressed in fine garments and adorned with jewelry. The ritual intensified. She was led to a wooden frame beside her dead master's body. 6 men entered the tent and took turns singing her, while others held her arms and legs. The girl screamed as the men invaded her. Then came the most brutal moment. An elderly woman known as the Angel of Death approached with a dagger. 2 men tightened a cord around the girl's neck, while the woman simultaneously stabbed between her ribs. The girl's body convulsed as blood poured from the wound. The strangling continued until she stopped struggling. Her corpse was placed beside her master's on the ship. Attendants piled wood around the vessel and set it ablaze. Within minutes, flames engulfed both bodies. The intense heat prevented anyone from approaching, as flesh and bone were reduced to ash. Ibn Fadlan recorded the scene with horror, noting that the Rus themselves appeared unmoved by the spectacle. To them, it was not a murder, but an honor, a servant accompanying her master into the next life through a ritual of fire and blood. Crucified Roman slave in Britain. In 2017, archaeologists made a disturbing discovery in Fenstanton, Cambridgeshire. Among the skeletal remains dating between AD 130 and 360 was a male who had suffered one of the Roman Empire's most notorious executions. The skeleton, estimated to be 25 to 35 years old at death, bore marks that told a horrifying story of his final moments. This was no ordinary burial. It was the first archaeological evidence of crucifixion ever found in Britain. Examination of the bones revealed thinning in the leg bones, consistent with prolonged shackling. This man had been physically restrained for extended periods before his execution. More disturbing was a nail found driven through his heel bone, unmistakable evidence of crucifixion. The nail had been hammered through from one side, exiting on the other, pinning the victim to the wooden cross. Historians estimate the crucifixion process lasted between hours and days. The victim was first scourged with a multi-tailed whip embedded with bone and metal. This alone could tear flesh from bone, causing extreme blood loss and exposing internal organs. In his weakened state, he was forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site. Once nailed to the cross, death came slowly. With arms stretched outward and upward, the chest muscles became increasingly paralyzed. Each breath required him to push up on his nailed feet, causing excruciating pain. Gradually, carbon dioxide built up in his bloodstream. He alternated between asphyxiation and searing pain for hours. The cause of death was likely a combination of shock, dehydration, and asphyxiation. His lungs slowly filled with fluid as his heart struggled to pump. Consciousness remained until near the end, forcing him to experience every moment of his execution. Despite this cruel death, his body was buried formally in a cemetery alongside other individuals, suggesting some measure of dignity was afforded him in death that he had not received in life. Impalement of slave Titus. In September 1714, in the colonial Caribbean, a slave named Titus faced one of history's most agonizing executions. Court records show Titus had been accused of plotting rebellion against his master. The colonial court condemned him to a punishment designed not just to kill, but to serve as a terrifying example to others: impalement. On the morning of his execution, Titus was led to the town square where a sharpened wooden stake had been secured vertically in the ground. Guards forced him to lie on his back as the stake's point was positioned at the base of his spine. With calculating precision, they pushed his body down onto the stake. The wood penetrated his body, forcing its way through his internal organs. The executioner's skill was horrific yet deliberate. They guided the stake carefully to avoid piercing vital organs that would cause immediate death. Instead, the wood passed alongside major blood vessels and organs, ensuring maximum suffering without quick release. When the stake emerged from his upper chest, Titus was lifted upright, the weight of his body driving the stake deeper. Witnesses recorded their shock as Titus remained conscious after the impalement. Blood ran down the stake as he hung suspended above the ground. His breathing became shallow and labored as his lungs struggled against the wooden intrusion. Despite catastrophic internal damage, death did not come quickly. For approximately 48 hours, Titus lingered in this state. During this time, court records note that he was offered arak, a strong alcoholic drink. Astonishingly, he consumed it, remarking that since he was stuck fast on the stake, there was no fear of his falling. His words revealed a horrifying lucidity despite his condition. After Titus finally succumbed to his wounds, executioners decapitated his corpse and severed his right hand. These body parts were mounted on poles outside his master's property, a gruesome warning to others who might consider similar acts of defiance. Sichar's severed slave. In the late 6th century, in the Loire Valley of Merovingian Gaul, a slave belonging to a nobleman named Sichar experienced one of the most brutal deaths recorded by Gregory of Tours. The slave, whose name was not preserved in historical records, had failed to complete assigned tasks to his master's satisfaction. What followed was a punishment that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to violence. Sichar began by beating the slave savagely, striking repeatedly with a wooden staff until the man's skin split open. Blood streamed from multiple wounds as the beating continued without mercy. In desperation, the slave grabbed Sichar's sword from its scabbard. This act of self-defense would seal his fate. Though the slave did not strike his master, the mere act of touching the weapon was deemed an unforgivable transgression. Sichar called for his allies, who quickly seized the bleeding man. They dragged him to a nearby tree where they had prepared tools for his punishment. The slave struggled, but weakened from the beating, could not resist the multiple hands restraining him. First, they severed his right hand, the one that had grasped the sword, using a sharp axe. The blade cut through flesh, tendon, and bone. The slave screamed as blood pulsed from the stump. Still conscious, he watched as they positioned his left hand on a wooden block. The axe fell again. Both feet followed in the same methodical manner. Each amputation was performed slowly, with deliberate cuts that prolonged the slave's awareness of his dismemberment. His screams gradually weakened as blood loss accelerated. Throughout the process, witnesses reported that Sichar watched impassively, ensuring the punishment was carried out completely. With the slave still alive, though barely conscious, they hoisted his mutilated body onto a hastily constructed gibbet. A rope around his neck tightened as they let his weight drop. His final moments were spent hanging, unable even to grasp at the rope with his severed limbs as he slowly suffocated. Rauching's condemned slave. In 6th century Merovingian France, Duke Rauching was known for his exceptional cruelty toward his slave. Gregory of Tours recorded one incident that stood out for its calculated psychological torment and slow execution. Two young slaves, a man and woman who worked in Rauching's household, had fallen in love and fled together, hoping to be married. When captured and returned to their master, they sought sanctuary in a local church. A priest intervened on their behalf, extracting a promise from Rauching that he would not separate the couple. Rauching agreed, but added ominously, "I will ensure they remain together eternally." The slaves were returned to his estate, believing they had secured mercy through the church's intercession. Rauching's first act of cruelty came at dinner that same evening. He ordered the male slave to hold a candle between his bare legs. As the wax melted, it scorched the slave's flesh. When the pain became unbearable and the slave attempted to move, Rauching threatened immediate execution. The slave remained still, as his skin blistered and charred, the scent of burning flesh filling the dining hall while Rauching and his guests continued eating. The following morning, Rauching ordered a coffin prepared. The two slaves watched in growing horror as servants dug a grave 7 feet deep. Rauching then had the couple seized. They struggled as guards forced them into the wooden box together. The woman screamed, realizing Rauching's true intent behind his promise not to separate. Once inside, Rauching ordered the lid nailed shut. The couple's muffled pleas could be heard from within as the coffin was lowered into the ground. "Now you shall be united forever," Rauching announced as servants began shoveling dirt onto the coffin. The couple's cries grew fainter as soil piled above them. Inside the buried coffin, air quickly depleted. The couple held each other in the darkness, gasping for breath as oxygen dwindled. Death came slowly through suffocation, their bodies found still embracing, when the grave was later excavated at the priest's insistence. The Beheaded Companion. In a 10th century Viking burial site in Stengade, Denmark, archaeologists uncovered a grave containing 2 skeletons, one of a high-status warrior surrounded by weapons and valuable grave goods, the other of a young male whose remains told a disturbing story. The secondary skeleton showed evidence of binding at the wrists and ankles. More telling was the position of the skull, separated from the body and placed at the feet of the primary burial. This was not a natural death, but a deliberate human sacrifice. The secondary individual was likely a thrall, a slave owned by the Viking warrior. Analysis of the bones revealed the slave was approximately 16 to 20 years old and had suffered periods of malnutrition throughout his short life. Cut marks on the cervical vertebrae indicated a methodical decapitation performed with a sharp blade, likely a sword or specialized knife. The sacrifice would have been conducted as part of the funeral ritual. As the warrior's body was prepared for burial, the slave was selected to accompany his master into the afterlife. The young man would have been aware of his impending death for either hours or possibly days beforehand. Unlike some ritualized deaths where intoxicants might dull the senses, evidence suggests the slave remained fully conscious during the procedure. The execution was performed with the slave positioned on his knees. His hands were bound behind his back with rope or leather straps, preventing any resistance. A wooden block was placed beneath his neck. The executioner, likely an experienced warrior, would have stood to one side, calculating the precise angle needed for a clean cut. The first strike severed the major blood vessels of the neck, causing immediate and catastrophic blood loss. The slave would have remained conscious for approximately 15 to 30 seconds, as blood pressure to the brain plummeted. Multiple subsequent blows were required to completely separate the head from the body, as evidenced by several distinct cut marks on the vertebrae. Once decapitated, the slave's body was arranged in the grave beside his master, his severed head placed at the foot of the burial, a servant in death as he had been in life. Amputated hands and feet. Between the 13th and 15th centuries in Estremad's southern Portugal, archaeologists uncovered evidence of one of history's most methodical punishments. At the edge of a medieval necropolis, far from the main burial area, lay 3 male skeletons side by side. All were young, estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old. Each skeleton displayed the same horrific mutilation. Their hands and feet had been systematically amputated. Forensic analysis revealed these were not battlefield injuries or post-mortem mutilation. The cut marks on the bones showed clean, deliberate severances made with sharp implements, likely axes or cleavers. More disturbing was evidence of bone healing at the amputation sites, indicating the victims lived for days after the initial mutilation. Historical records from the period describe this punishment being reserved for slaves who had attempted escape multiple times. The process began in public, designed to serve as a warning to others. The victims were secured to wooden tables or benches, their limbs extended and immobilized. The executioner would start with the feet. A precise blow separated each foot at the ankle. Blood vessels were sometimes cauterized with hot irons to prevent immediate death from blood loss. Each victim remained conscious, experiencing the full pain of the procedure. Next came the hands, severed at the wrists with similar precision. Without proper medical care, infection set in quickly. Fever, delirium, and septic shock followed within days. The victims experienced extreme thirst as their bodies fought systemic infection. Pain would have been constant and severe, unrelieved by any medication. Death, when it finally came after approximately 3 to 5 days, resulted from septicemia rather than blood loss. The deliberate placement of these bodies at the cemetery's edge, separate from other burials, showed that even in death, these individuals were considered outcasts. Their punishment continued symbolically, denied the dignity of proper burial among the community, and marked by their mutilations as transgressors even in the afterlife. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.